This is an extract from the Leader Coronavirus Daily podcast by the Evening Standard and hosted by me, David Marsland. To hear the whole thing, search for it on your podcast provider. The coronavirus furlough scheme has kept jobs and businesses alive throughout this pandemic. It's coming to an end, but COVID-19 is still here, and companies, especially our hospitality ones, still face restrictions like 10 p.m. curfews on pubs and restaurants. The government has always refused to extend the furlough deadline. It announced a less generous job support scheme to replace it. But with some parts of England now facing even further lockdown rules, pub closures have apparently not been ruled out. The Chancellor is partially relenting. It's not the nationwide furlough we've seen so far, but our editorial column says at least it's something.
A new furlough scheme for areas affected by local lockdowns, paying 2/3 of workers' wages in businesses forced to close, is expected from Chancellor Rishi Sunak. It's an essential step that will keep some afloat, but probably not enough to help others with accumulated debts survive. That's worrying on a day when official figures show economic growth in August slowing to 2.1%, and when the threat of lockdown restrictions hangs over the city too. Mr. Sunak has done well so far, but must be ready to give further assistance to keep businesses going.
Our consumer business editor, Jonathan Prynn, is with me. Jonathan, it's kind of like furlough being introduced, but I thought the Chancellor had been pretty clear the scheme couldn't continue.
Yes, very much so. They've been very adamant that there won't be an extension of the national furlough scheme, but I think also recognising that the new wave of local restrictions, which particularly hit the hospitality sector, are proving extremely difficult for businesses, small businesses in particular, in the restaurant, bar, club, pub sectors. So what they're saying is that businesses in areas with new, very tough restrictions on trading for those sorts of companies, they will pay up to 2/3 of salary while they are closed down. So it is a furlough 2.0, but it's extremely limited in its scope. It's only for hospitality businesses that are having to close down because of very, very severe local lockdowns. And that doesn't affect London yet, but it may do.
So this will not be the kind of nationwide furlough scheme. This isn't the sort of thing that's going to help self-employed people, for example. There's going to be no help along those lines outside of any areas.
No, exactly. He's already announced the winter help programme, which is has been generally seen as much less helpful than the general furlough. The initial furlough, I think, was seen as one of the few really, really big success stories of the government's handling of the whole pandemic. It certainly saved many millions of jobs during the full lockdown and gave confidence to employers and employees. But it ends soon, and everyone is rather waiting in trepidation to see what happens when it does come to an end on the 31st of October. But this very limited sort of son of furlough scheme is for one sector and only in very limited geographical parts of the country.
Outside of furlough, one of the Chancellor's other big schemes was Eat Out to Help Out, and that was supposed to get our economy through this, but we're starting to see signs now that it didn't quite have the impact that the government was hoping. GDP is up, but kind of barely, isn't it?
Yeah, these are really, really worrying figures. August should have been a really strong month. The city forecasters were penciling in 4.5-5% growth. The continuation of the steady or strong growth seen in June and July, bouncing back from the depths of the incredible fall in output in April. But it only came in at 2.1%, less than half what people have been hoping for. This is a real worry because August, as you say, should have been a strong month. We had the Eat Out to Help Out. We had also the staycation boom, meant that hotels had a bumper summer. And if you put the restaurant sector and the hotel sector together, they account for more than half of this 2.1% growth that we saw in August. So in other words, the rest of the economy was barely growing. And I think that will alarm people, alarm the Chancellor and people in the Bank of England and the Treasury, because we're going into the autumn without the boost from Eat Out to Help Out, and with a load of new restrictions, which points to a very, very tough winter for the economy. Some forecasters are even now beginning to talk about a return to recession later on.
Where's the turnaround going to come from, Jonathan? What could it be? When could we see it?
Well, that's such a good question. I mean, the sort of turnaround time keeps getting pushed a season out, doesn't it? It was going to be summer, then it was going to be autumn. Already beginning to hear the first sort of suggestions it won't be spring, it'll be next summer. We know that the government expects the new round of restrictions to be in place for 6 months. So that takes us up to March. We also know that their record on forecasting a return to normality is utterly dire. So as the governor of the Bank of England, Andrew Bailey, said a couple of days ago, the risks are all on the downside, which is kind of economists speak for it's much more likely to get worse than better than what we expect.
Search for the Leader Coronavirus Daily on any podcast provider to hear more from the podcast.